Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interviewed Jesse Arlen, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University and director of the Krikor and Clara Zohrab Information Center, to talk about politics and Christianity in 10th century Armenia. Jesse, thanks for joining us on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Nakota. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you start by giving people a little bit of a cursory overview of what it is that you study, what are some of the main arguments, but also giving some historical and geographical context, because you study Armenia, which I think now more people are increasingly aware of, the geography of Armenia and sort of the culture and history, but I still think it's largely unknown compared to some other Asian countries. So if you can sort of contextualize that along with the overview of your research.
Sure. So usually how I explain what I do is to come at it from the perspective of saying that I study Eastern Christianity in general. So this would refer to Christianity that doesn't derive from the Latin or Western European Christian tradition that gave rise to what we know today as like Catholicism or Protestantism, but the so-called Eastern or Orthodox world, which comprises not just the maybe more well-known like Greek and Russian, Slavic Orthodox communities, but also lesser or what's sometimes referred to as Oriental Orthodox communities, which includes Egyptian, Coptic, Ethiopian, Armenian, and Syriac. And so these Christian communities existed outside of the Roman and Byzantine Empire for most of their history. And many of them, or most of them, belong to the Islamic world, whether that was the Arab caliphates or the Persian Empire, or in more recent times, the Ottoman Empire. So these are Christian communities that generally live around North and Eastern Africa, West Asia, but in the case of the Syriac Christian communities, even in India or China, in earlier periods of history, which we could talk about if we want to. So my focus within that is generally on the Armenian Christians. And Armenia is a country today. So it's located on a map. If you find Turkey and go immediately east, that's where you'll find the Republic of Armenia today. It's kind of a fraction of the geographical territory where Armenians have traditionally lived in that region. And due to, the events of the early 20th century, which most of us are familiar with, the Armenian genocide and its aftermath, there's not so many Armenians living in that part of the world today, but that's still the center of the Armenian church. And so my research and focus within all of this is generally on the medieval, late antique and medieval period, which is when the Armenian tradition is kind of most being formed, and some of its great writers and thinkers and theologians lived.
And you specifically talk about a couple of notable figures, one of them being Anania of Narek. So can you talk a little bit about this person? This person wrote something called the Book of Instruction. And if you could just sort of talk a little bit about why this person and the literature that this person produced is important to Armenia
Sure.
at that time. And specifically, I guess, to give a little more to that. You specifically talk about 10th century Armenia, which was the time that this person was alive.
Yes. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, yeah, the 10th century is a critical period for Armenian history, especially Armenian Christian history. Why? Because this is the period when these larger cenobitic, so communal monastic institutions are formed and founded and endowed by local noble lords, princes, and kings. And why is that so important? It's because those monastic institutions then became the principal producers and transmitters of culture, art, education, intellectual activity, and the like up until the early modern period. The most famous Armenian writer, he's a mystical poet, is Gregory of Narek, Krikor Naregatsi in Armenian. He belonged to this Narek monastery, which is located in present-day Turkey on the southeastern shores of Lake Van, if you want to look on a map later. And this figure, he has kind of the stature in Armenian tradition of like Dante for Italian, or even Shakespeare for English, kind of like the one big writer that stands out from the rest. In Armenian tradition, he's often treated as almost like he fell out of heaven. We don't know where he came from and this kind of thing. So I was first attracted to pre-modern Armenian literature through this writer and his great poetry, religious poetry. It's like reading Rumi, the great Persian poet who's so popular today. And my initial interest in Anania was to find out more about, where Gregory came from. So Anania was the first abbot and founder of Narek Monastery. And he was the one in charge with organizing the community life at the monastery, the educational system, the spiritual and physical practices that the monks underwent there, and also writing, instruction, and teaching. Anania's works were essentially unknown and unpublished until only about 10 years ago, thanks to the work of a scholar in Armenia known as Harachia Tamrazian, who now has passed away. He published all his work in Armenian, and so Anania has remained largely unknown in the, let's say, Western or just kind of English-speaking global academic community. And so as I got into reading Anania's works more, my initial interest was much more in the kind of internal life of the monastery. So like, how was it that Gregory was produced, someone like this, So that led me to Anania's Book of Instruction, which is a work that he wrote to guide and instruct the young monks who were entering into the monasteries at this time. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the period when all these large monasteries are being formed. So what does that mean? So there's dozens of monasteries founded in the 10th century, and we know from contemporaries that there were monks living in some of these of up to 300 to 400 monks. And it can't be the case that there just all of a sudden were this many people who just wanted to go to monasteries. This is a kind of societal decision, and it's a place of the world where you're kind of assigned roles in society. So a lot of these monks were probably very young boys who were sent here at a young age, and it was the task of abbots and the leaders of monasteries to kind of instruct and inform their worldview, shape their desires, shape their interests. And so a lot of this book of instruction focuses especially on these initial stages of the monastic training. Um, so as such, it's a key source for understanding the internal life of Armenian monasteries, which lack sources in most cases, because if you know anything about monastic history for Latin or Greek monasticism, there's often written rules that tell you exactly what monks are supposed to do at certain times of day, throughout the week, etc., what the educational system is, what they would read, etc. Armenian society is, in many spheres of society, predominantly oral. And so this kind of thing, the internal regulation of monastic life, would have probably been left up to kind of oral instruction and oral direction and not been written down. So it's through texts such as these that we can kind of get a peek behind the curtain into the internal life. And so that's one main reason why it's so important. And then as I continued investigating Anania's works, I saw that he responded to a lot of these other kind of major developments of the 10th century in Armenian society. And so the scope of the project kind of broadened out into seeing the 10th century and Armenia's place within it through the works of this monk of Narek named Anania.
Part of your work is a microhistory by looking at this one individual, but it does delve into larger political issues that were happening in Armenia at the time. You talk particularly about a controversy that Anania finds himself in. Can you talk a little bit about that controversy, how he was tied to it, and what this meant for Armenian society at that time?
Yeah, it's a very interesting aspect of the project, and one of the problems of it that I struggled with the most. So there's a group known as Tondraketsi, which in our English we can just say Tondrakian. It refers to a place name and people who are from that region. So this is not far from where Anania lived at Narek. In Armenian historiography, it's often assumed, and it's presented in the sources, that Armenians all converted to Christianity in the 5th century or 4th century, and kind of like in one fell swoop. But we know from other sources and various other material that the conversion was very gradual process and not all at once. And there were pockets of pre-Christian, Zoroastrian, kind of unconverted Armenian populations existing all throughout Armenia, or the region where Armenians lived, up until the 20th century. And likewise, there were groups of Armenians who were Christian, or maybe had a kind of syncretistic sort of belief system that was kind of combined Christian, the official like Christian religion, with their pre-Christian folk beliefs and practices. And so one such community is the Tondraketsi. And there's been a lot of scholarship and work on just exactly where did these people come from, what their beliefs were, how they related to other kind of heretical sects and groups of the time. My interest was guided by the fact that in the 10th century and early 11th century, there's a whole lot of monastic figures that are accused of being Tondraketsi. And so the question became, how could it be the case that these monks who belong to, the institutional church could be accused of being part of a group that does not belong to the institutional church and is kind of a Christian heretical sect? So after a lot of digging and research and reading between the lines of some of the sources, and Anania was commissioned to write a refutation, or a polemical work against the Tondrakians. But then at the end of his life, he was denounced as a Tondrakian heretic himself and exiled from Narek Monastery. So Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw this extra question in because for someone listening now, particularly if they're listening from uh, the US or Western Europe, where life is now pretty secular, why was this controversial? Why was being associated with one church over the other considered something that was so sort of blasphemous to even consider?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there wasn't the idea back then that there should be like many different sorts of churches or groups. This is still a time when there's the kind of splits that say define the Christian landscape today are not really solidified yet. And so it was the mission of kind of every church or people to have like one united, Catholic or universal sort of church. And so Armenian society in particular, because the culture and people were divided between various empires, the church took on itself the role of being the unifying force, uniting all Armenians together and creating this like single identity for Armenians despite which empire or political state they belong to. And so in Armenian society in particular, there was this extra emphasis on having everyone part of the main institutional church because of this fragmented state of Armenian society.
So, can you go into talking just a little bit more about Narek Monastery in particular, and what type of political and economic importance slash position did it have in Armenia at the time? And thinking about that in relation to other contemporary monasteries. And I guess just as an addition to that, is this monastery still around today? Is this something that you could still go to?
Sure. So at the time, there are these various Armenian noble families that are aspiring to local kingship and dominance over one another, we could say. And they're trying to get for themselves the title of like supreme king, either from the Arab Caliphate or the Byzantine Empire. Those are kind of the two main powers at the time. And so part of the way that these princes bolster their own position is by their philanthropic works and their public works projects, both civic and religious. So monasteries play this role of kind of through the philanthropic work of the ruler, they kind of bolster the prestige of the ruler. And so the more renowned, spiritually renowned a monastery is, the better it reflects on the ruler who patronized it. So some monasteries serve various other functions, such as being mausoleums, burial places for rulers, or they're located on trade routes and they house merchants and people traveling along the trade routes. Narek was founded to be to carry this kind of like spiritual capital or spiritual clout. And it was founded right nearby the capital of the local ruler, Gagik Artsruni, who patronized it. And through the fame of its monastic writers and spiritual leaders, such as Anania and Krikor and another figure named Uchtanas, it brought great prestige to the local family that sponsored it.
So, I mean, not to draw too many comparisons between 10th century Armenia and 21st century US, but can a modern listener think about this in terms of, for example, you have a presidential candidate running for office and they get endorsed by a church organization or something like that? Can they think of that as sort of having the same political gravity?
Absolutely. And a lot of the religious building projects of these princes, or the equivalent of the political leaders of today, they also sponsored historians to write and record their great works. And some of the scenes read like just like political photo ops today, where there's great description about the grandeur of the building and positioning the king in just the right place to show his patronage here, just like politicians today will go to do photo ops at benevolent works projects, or being in a very religiously significant place, or culturally significant place, to associate themselves with that and present themselves as patrons or sponsors of this. It's a great comparison, actually.
I want to think a little bit more about modern times. I guess one of the questions that we didn't quite touch on was, is that monastery still around today?
Yes.
But also, just we could tie this into, I guess, how does Anania of Narek kind of factor into Armenian society today? Is this a person that, if you go to Armenia, people still think about, or is he really just something that's only talked about in history class? And if you are just in a grade school history class, how is this person or this time period discussed in general?
Great question. So returning to the question of Narek Monastery, so you could have gone to Narek Monastery up until the early 20th century. And we have photographs in black and white of what the monastery looked like in 1906, when someone traveled there, and a European traveled there and took photographs of it. During the genocide of the 20th century, 1915, and its aftermath, the monastery, like many other Armenian religious sites in the region, were destroyed. For Narek Monastery in particular, it was kind of leveled and a mosque was built in its place, and it's unrecognizable today, unfortunately, as is the case with many Armenian monuments and property that is located in the Republic of Turkey today. And so, along with the destruction of architectural and monumental space, is a real loss of the literary and artistic culture. And part of my work is a recovery of, part of my calling, honestly, as I see it academically, is a recovery of Armenian material, literary, and religious culture, which is endangered and kind of, if not on the brink of extinction, it is just unknown aside from a few major figures and themes. So if you went to Armenia today and you asked even very well-educated people, who is Anania of Narek, they wouldn't know. And so that's one of the motivating factors of the work, is that Armenian cultural heritage is so at risk, and even today, because of the recent war last year, is even more at risk and just in danger of being lost if people don't A, bring attention to it, but B, really dig deep into some of the buried treasures in this culture, its language, and its heritage, and just bring them into public view.
My second to last question kind of ties into what you were just talking about. And I want to see if you could maybe talk a little bit more about, most of my podcast guests are scholars of the modern period, and in academia, there seems to be more of an emphasis on studies of modern history. And that was one of the reasons I was interested in asking you on, is because you don't study that. And so you're giving us a different historical perspective. But even when you sort of go out in public and, you know, ask, talk to people about history, a sense, at least that I get when I talk to a lot of people, is they don't really see an importance in history that isn't, recent history. They sort of feel like, oh, well, that was 1,000 years ago, who cares? I guess from your experience working on this research, what would you say, if you could give an elevator pitch, is the best argument for why people should still be learning history, even though it's like 1,000 years old or 2,000 years old?
Yeah, that's a great question and a very important one. So I guess what motivates me personally, and what I assume would be of interest to others, is I don't think time is necessarily of the greatest relevance if we look to the example, say, of like the Greek classics, or the Latin Roman classics, or the works, the Tao Te Ching, or the great works of wisdom literature from different peoples and cultures of the time. My attraction to this period and its writers and works is an attraction and pursuit of beauty on the one hand and wisdom on the other. And these kind of things, these instantiations of beauty and wisdom are found in every culture and are relevant for all times and all peoples. So if Armenian culture, which I'm, because of my ethnic background and particular situatedness, is lost to the world loses something beautiful, and it loses wisdom. And so that's what motivates me, and what I hope my work can present to the modern world is, carefully picked and curated treasures, beauty and wisdom from the past, from a culture and people that many people either haven't heard of or don't know much of anything about its cultural and religious tradition.
So before we wrap up, one question that I always ask guests is, if someone's listening to this and they're interested in learning more about 10th century Armenia, or Armenian religious history, or anything related to that, what would be one or two books that you would recommend someone go read?
There's a few. So Gregory of Narek, this writer I mentioned, who's so famous and is from the 10th century and is the pupil of Anania, he was declared a doctor of the Catholic Church by Pope Francis 5 or 6 years ago, the first time that an Armenian attained this status. And so because of that, there's been some kind of renewed Western interest in who was this figure that we're now supposed to be venerating or revering. And so there's been some great books that have come out recently, both a study of Gregory of Narek by a writer, Michael Papazian, that's called The Doctor of Mercy. This is an introduction to Gregory of Narek, his life, his works, but also Armenian Christianity, that's aimed at a Western audience that doesn't really know anything about the Armenia or the time period. So that's one. And then another is by the same press, it's Liturgical Press Academic in Collegeville, Minnesota, is the prayer book of Gregory of Narek, just out this year. So I talked about his mystical religious poetry. A great scholar, retired Abraham Terion, has translated that book, and if it's not out now, it's going to be out in a week. And then he also translated like minor liturgical and poetic works of Gregory of Narek in a book, again by the same press, The Festal Works of Gregory of Narek. And if you buy one or two or three of those, you'll get a great picture of the time. Abraham Terrion gives excellent commentary and kind of background help for readers that might be unfamiliar with references or names or things like that. And also you can just experience the beauty of the poetry and the spiritual depth and richness of it for yourself.
Great, Jesse. Thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Nakota, and keep up all your great work.
And for those who are interested in seeing more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.